Olawumni Ola-BUSARI is a policy officer for the One Campaign, which is a global movement campaigning to end extreme poverty. Good evening and welcome, Olawumni. How badly has COVID-19 and the management of the pandemic affected African countries' abilities to deal with its legacy poverty and hunger challenges?
Good evening, and thank you so much for having me on your show tonight. COVID has been a big setback, I think, for African countries, mostly because they have now had to spend so much in mounting an adequate health and economic response to COVID. And this means that they've had to divert funds that could have been used to help support continued development goals in education and in further health developments. So really, it's also the effect that lockdowns as well had on people's ability to be able to work. So we know a lot of people lost jobs, weren't able to go to work, weren't able to put food on their table for the period of the lockdown, and that has set many Africans back in terms of the strides that we had made over the last 10 years before COVID in eradicating poverty.
We'll talk about what happens, on the rest of in the rest of the globe and in other markets. But let us begin by looking at how the continent can mobilize to help those most affected.
Yes. So really, we need to do more to not just think about our own populations, but to think about the interdependency between countries. So I think in the immediate term, what we really need is for countries to avoid export bans on key commodities as we're seeing prices rise. As some African countries have done already, we need to reverse that trend. We also need to fully fund the World Food Program and other UN humanitarian appeals to respond to the increasingly dire food crisis all over the world. And I think more in the medium term, we need to strengthen investments in African agricultural productivity and make sure that we have greater sovereignty as a continent, because as we've seen, a lot of the effects of the Russia invasion of Ukraine has significant ripple effects for the price of things like vegetable oil, wheat, barley, and as net importers of these goods, many African countries are now finding that the prices for staple goods such as bread and mealie meal are skyrocketing. So food sovereignty has to be a priority for us moving forward.
Yeah, I think one of the other calls that you're making is around the creation of a humanitarian corridor to allow some of those grain exports out of Ukraine to mitigate against some of the, some of the shortages and the human impact that you've been describing. But I want to go back to this point that you make, which has been made really on the African continent since time immemorial. This around strengthening investments in African agricultural productivity and in food sovereignty. This is not a new call, and yet we haven't been able to become as self-sufficient as perhaps we have needed to be, especially in the context of what we're seeing now, these unexpected convergencies of global events.
Yes, no, it's definitely not a new call. I think that the issue of climate change really is one that's pressing. If you look at Ethiopia, and Somalia and the whole Horn of Africa and what's happening there, what we're seeing is the chickens come home to roost as a result of climate inaction. So it's not just about investing in agriculture, it's also about investing in Africa's capacity to respond to climate change and its devastating effects, especially on farmers, smallholder farmers who depend on rain-fed agriculture. So, we need rich countries, G7 countries, to meet their commitment of providing $100 billion a year towards climate action for lower and middle income countries. We need to see national development commitments funded. So it's both dealing with climate change and then also changing our views around agriculture. Agriculture employs a majority of Africans, and we need young people to also invest their skills in those areas. But we need government to meet them with appropriate investments, even more now than before because of the threat of climate change.
Olawumni Ola-BUSARI, thank you very much for talking to us this evening. Appreciate your time and your analysis on this really important and critical issue that affects not only people's livelihoods, but their very lives.